We start with a big-nosed bloke falling from the sky, and after landing in the middle of a random jungle, it suddenly starts raining men. Hallelujah. As some machete-looking fella almost lands on top of him, as does a dead body, because this dopey fella forgot to open his chute when going for an afternoon skydiving sheet. Also suddenly, some Russian nutter starts shooting at them, and they shortly meet a small brunette who's totally part of the Israeli Defence Force, and magically is also an expert on all things jungle. And she reckons this ain't anywhere on Earth that she recognises, but they just say put the tinfoil hat away, girl, and stop being a conspiracy theorist. Before she reveals how she saw more parachutes coming into land, so the lead mercenary, what seemed to love pianos in a previous life, heads straight over to award them. On the way over, they briefly talk about what they all remember, and the small brunette soon realises that, just like on 9/11, there seems to be no planes at all, because they all just simply woke up in freefall. But the group just scoff and say you watch too much Alex Jones, love. And before she can say, well, he was right about the gay frogs, they soon come across a notorious felon wrestling in the mud with an African warlord. Before he says they should all stick together, and probably also go get the other dopey twat what seems to identify as a bat, because he's totally hanging upside down in a tree.
Not a great plan.
After they cut him down, he says he's a doctor, before they run into some Asian fella just staring at a bunch of skulls. Apparently these are a form of trophies, and the African warlord knows all about that, because he totally does the same back home. Speaking of home, they all mention that the last thing they remember is being in some form of combat before being scooped up and dropped out of a plane because reasons. And they all decide to follow that big-nosed merc because he's the only fellow who seems to know what the frig he's doing. After the doctor bloke bizarrely has to tell the Russian guy not to touch random plants in a strange jungle because they're full of neurotoxins that'll totally paralyse you, said big-nosed merc refuses to tell the small brunette his name and says he's better off on his own. So naturally, she shows him a leaf what keeps spinning around in a small pond. And he says, yeah, that's well weird, bro. And then goes on to tell her about some other stuff what he finds pretty weird, like how everyone here is a total badass, except that soy boy doctor fellow who loves getting stuck in trees. So that's also a bit dodgy. Later, they wonder why they were chosen, before a fuck ton of booby traps go off in the woods and almost end up killing them all. Whilst they soon come across a deaded soldier who they reckon must have made a last stand, seemingly by sitting down, which naturally led to him getting his chest blown open and shit. Then they come to a clearing and are presented with a horrific vision. And no, I don't mean that time you stumbled onto your nana's OnlyFans page, but the confounding sight of various planets, with more balls in the sky than a nudie naked circus act. And the small brunette just scoffs and says, see, I told you so, losers. And I ain't a phony fakey Alex Jones type conspiracy theorist, but actually a rather successful conspiracy realist. But before they can fully process that they're somehow on an alien planet and thus more screwed than a kiddie fiddler in the prison showers, some spiky canine creatures appear and tries to munch them up, before the small brunette shooter totally jams, and it looks like it's curtains for the wacko conspiracy theorist what loves InfoWars and also being right about everything. So naturally, she tries to self-abort like a right pussy old mill. But luckily, a faint whistle goes off which totally calls off their hellhounds, and the big-nosed merc soon realises that they just got flushed out and are totally being hunted, cause the whole planet seems to be one giant game reserve, only they're the game. They soon discover, however, that one of them is missing, and that poor machete-looking fella seems to be calling out for help in the middle of a small field. So naturally, the big-nosed merc throws a rock at him, and turns out he's been booby-trapped by whatever's hunting him. So they totally abandon his Mexican ass whilst the small brunette pops a cap in him to end his misery. But the fella keeps on calling for help, despite being deader than Danny Trejo's soul when he was forced to appear on The Masked Singer just to pay for his kids' college bills. Bruh. And turns out his voice was totally being mimicked by whatever it is that's hunting him. Later, the big-nosed merc is sick and tired of running away like a right cuck, and so they all follow the tracks of the spiky alien canines back to their base, and soon discover a disgusting ET tied to a tree. And they're all shocked and stunned at coming face to face with an interstellar space freak, whilst also being a bit offended given this alien fella seems to have culturally appropriated Jamaican hairstyles and thinks it's okay to casually don Rastafari dreadlocks and shit. Oh hell no! Then they notice the lack of a big-nosed merc in their midst. Well, suddenly, the African warlord is penetrated by a ghost, and the group all start getting shot up by invisible spooks, before they're all chased down a hill and proceed to tumble over a giant fuck-off waterfall. And we then finally get a good look at what's been hunting them all this time, and turns out it's totally not a bunch of ghosty ghouly spooks, but actually more of them dreadlock predator fellas what love cultural appropriation and shit. So the gang soon regroup, as they all bollock the murky boy for using them as bait, but he just says, lol, what ifs, because now we know what we're up against, so shut up about it already. But that's when the small brunette reveals that she recognised them predator fellas, because back in '87, an Austrian bodybuilder with a funny accent totally went up against one of those things and managed to beat it by rolling about in the mud and shouting about getting to choppers and stuff. So the big-nosed merc comes up with a plan, which is to lure the aliens over to him by totally hiding in the corner like a right bunch of cacks. Cause then they can force their enemies into a choke point and just hope they all shoot their alien mates instead of all of them. Or some shit. A little later, and they're attacked by a weird creature that's soon killed by a masked stranger who's randomly popped out of nowhere. Turns out they've been saved by that Morpheus fella from the Matrix films, but he seems to have left the drug trade now because he totally don't have any kind of coloured pills to offer him this time. So after they go back to Zion, a random crashed spaceship in the middle of fucking nowhere, he tells them that he's a total scavenger and has been there for about 10 years. Because these predator fellas do this hunting thing every few seasons, so he's totally picked up on a thing or two. Apparently, he's killed 2 or 3 of them racist fuckers what keep nicking his ancestors' hairstyles, and the aliens seem to be in some sort of civil war with each other. Because much like what happens in most state schools, the big ones like to bully the smaller ones and shit. Anyway, this batshit crazy Morpheus fella, who keeps joking with someone who he made up in his own head to keep him company all these years, tells them that there's a dropship about 30 yards from the aliens' base camp. So naturally, the big-nosed merc wants to get to it pronto, despite not having the first clue about how to pilot a giant fuck-off alien spaceship. So after they get some sleep and the Asian Yakuza fella finds a random sword tucked away in a hidden corner, they suddenly wake up to thick smoke, as that batshit crazy Morpheus fella is totally trying to kill them all, because he can't possibly feed 6 more people, and also wants to scavenge all their gear and stuff. And after they realise they're trapped worse than that Kesha bird in a poorly negotiated recording contract, the big-nosed merc shoots the side of the ship to totally alert them predator fellas, who quickly head on up there where they confront their long-lost enemy. And it looks like it's curtains for the batshit crazy Morpheus fella, who apparently survived a decade on the planet, all because the dopey alien peeps totally forgot to check the interior of that random crashed spaceship and shit. Once the creatures attack though, the doctor blokes can get separated from the group because reasons. But luckily, the Russian fella saves him and totally does one of them self-sacrifice things, also because reasons. And before you can say, okay, but why aren't the predators skinning anyone in this movie? They escape the ship, and the notorious felon fella soon celebrates having killed that grotesque ugly foreigner. But said grotesque ugly foreigner's brother is standing right behind him, and totally resents this geezer's gross and shameless display of rampant xenophobia, and so promptly blasts away the notorious felon before aiming his sights toward the merc's big nose. But said notorious felon fella totally ain't dead yet, and so jumps on the back of his would-be killer and starts stabbing him up and shit. But naturally, he's no match for the giant fuck-off alien chief, who promptly rips out his skull and spine, whilst the other remaining predator heads on after him. But the Asian Yakuza fella decides to stop running and totally make a final stand because reasons. Before the 2 honourable warriors end up honourably yeeting each other in a small field. Elsewhere, the last 3 protagonists race through the jungle toward the ship, but the pussy old doctor bloke runs straight into a bear trap, and it looks like it's curtains for the suspiciously nice and totally out of place soy boy with no relevant skills to even be considered worthy of being put here by the elite trophy hunters and shit. And because he can't really walk properly anymore, the big-nosed merc just says let's leave him here and we'll totally booby-trap his ass, so we can then blow them predator goons to kingdom come. But the small brunette totally wants to stay and help the pitiful injured man who keeps whining to go with him, because she's still retained her humanity. But Big Nose just says you're totally done, mate, so shut up about it already. So he heads off to free that captured smaller alien from earlier what was tied to a tree, in the hopes that he'll be able to pilot the ship and take him back home in exchange for freeing him and shit. Whilst the other 2 are instantly captured in a small net like a right bunch of cacks. Anyway, after activating the ship, The Predator chief arrives and starts smacking up that smaller alien what keeps getting tied to trees, so the big nose merc runs off to the ship, which promptly takes off, as the alien chief decapitates his smaller foe and then blasts the ship out of the sky before he can leave. Meanwhile, the other two heroes have been dropped off into a hole, and in a shocking twist what no one could ever see coming, turns out the random doctor bloke, what was the only one who wasn't a deadly warrior and totally didn't belong at all in this scenario, was somehow a Predator spy all along, and proceeds to paralyse the small brunette with a flower mucus, what he showed the Russian bloke a bit earlier in the film. But before he can finish her off, that big nose merc appears, as he luckily missed the ship before it took off and got blowed up real good and proper. And after he gets them out of the pit, the phony fakey doctor bloke tries to yeet him and all, but Captain Big Nose is totally too quick for him, and drags him off into the middle of the camp just as the Predator chief returns, and probably gets himself blown to Kingdom Come, because the doctor bloke has been totally booby-trapped by the crafty merc with the big hooter. Said crafty merc with the massive hooter then decides to make one of them final stand things, given it's worked out so well for everyone else in this film, and uses a fuck ton of fire to mask the body heat and confuse the ugly brute, before smacking him up worse than a Chris Brown floozy. But he eventually regains his senses and blasts the murky fella with his plasma cannon. But luckily, the small brunette has regained just enough motor functions to pop a shot off at the Predator fella, who then takes a small blade to the shoulder for her troubles, but giving the big nose yet surprisingly muscly merc just enough time to beat his predatory foe to a pulp and then slice his noggin off. Said big nose but surprisingly muscly merc then goes over to the small brunette who just saved his life, and finally tells her that his name is Royce, and she says that her name is Isabel. And before you can say, well, the movie's almost over now and I highly doubt anyone gives a shit, we end with a hunting season cycle starting all over again as the pair vow to find a way to get off the planet, despite that batshit crazy Morpheus fella specifically stating that there's absolutely no way off the planet. And he should know, because he tried to find one for the best part of a decade already. And that's it. That's the movie. Though my favourite part was realising that although this movie was called Predators, it was actually about killer aliens, and not, as I initially thought, a hard-hitting documentary about creepy Hollywood film producers. Bruh. But anyway, that's the plot and that's your lot. Considering that bell thing so you don't miss any future recaps. Tell me if you like this flick in the comments if you have time, and I'll see you in the next one.